we've been going through with United Kingdom and Divided Kingdom, Judah alone, going through all those kings and the history, which it's really interesting to read through those accounts and see God's hand and His plan unfolding through there. I don't know that I'll ever not be amazed at how, when it's down to one person in keeping God's promises, and God, through His faithfulness, finds a way to preserve even at the threat of death. And so it's an amazing thing for us to see as we go. So we're going to start with a review, a little bit more involved review than what we've done the last few time periods, and then go ahead and get into Daniel and Ezekiel as we consider Judah's time during the captivity. So let's simply start with our time periods. Before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, judges, United Kingdom, Divided Kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. All right, so hopefully you've gotten all those. I still see some of y'all wanting to add the Egyptian bondage. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, we're not going to chastise you for that. But those are the 17 that we're going through because that's what Brother Waldron has in his material. So hopefully you're getting those. And as we continue to work through our cycles, you'll learn more details about this and connecting some things. Speaking of connecting, let's very quickly go through our linking stories. So we have before the flood, and what links us to the flood? Generations. Genesis chapter 5. So we have that. So then the flood, and then what do we have? Generations again in chapter 10. All right, so then after the flood, the scattering of the people, then what do we have? Generations. So the first three are super easy. 5, 10, and 11 all go through the generations, and that's kind of what ties it together. It kind of hit me as I was studying this afternoon. The time periods function in two different ways. I think that some of these you could call major events in history, and some of them are major sections of history. Because the flood, although it lasted a year, that's a major event in history.
It didn't really take that long.
Yeah, in the grand scheme,
time.
right? It's a short period of time, and so that's the kind of the way I think about these. Before the flood, we have the creation. Well, that's only 6 days, and so there's several things that we can see progressing. But that's why those generations fast forward us, because there's not major events that take place that are worthy of note, and that's by God's showing us through His Word more than my opinion. So that's kind of how those first three work. Then we get to a time period, a longer period, several hundred years, and so we get to the patriarchs. And so we fast forwarded to Abraham, and then what links us to the next period? Joseph. We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph, and then they go down to Egypt because of God delivering them from the famine, God using Joseph and his brothers. And so that links us to why they needed the Exodus, because while they were there, they were put in bondage. And so now we're in the Exodus. What connects the Exodus to the wandering in the wilderness? Sir? Kadesh Barnea, yes. That's just a city. What's the events at Kadesh Barnea? That's right, though. That's right, the spies. So you had the 12 spies sent in, and so we see that, and the people rebel. They reject the promised land that they were to go scout out. And so that prompts us and leads us into the wandering of the wilderness. So we get through the punishment time period, the 40 years of wandering, and so now we're ready to invade and conquer. What puts the bow on the wandering in the wilderness that leads us to the invasion and conquest? What are those final events? Yes, sir. Crossing the Jordan. That's manna stopping, Passover. And so that's the major things. When they partake of the land and God withholds the manna at that point, that time period is over. And we can see now He has delivered them into the land. And so they're able to invade and conquer the land. So we go through the invasion and the conquest. What is the into the invasion and conquest that ties us to the judges. The distribution of the land and the covenant is renewed because it's been a while. There's been some things that have happened, and so we have those two things going.
It's almost like that has to happen with every generation.
Yes.
Because it happened at Sinai. It happened with the next generation that went in. It's going to happen multiple times. We get to the next time period, you're going to see kind of this renewal of the covenant. And it's almost like this reminder that every generation is responsible for having this covenant relationship with God that's not just handed to them by their fathers and mothers in the faith, but that they individually have. And we've talked about, our need to have an individual relationship with God, not just something passed down to us. And I think that has to be one of the reasons you see the covenant renewed so often with different generations throughout the Old Testament.
In preparation for some of our last classes, I read that during the divided kingdom in Judah alone, there are 4 separate occasions that the covenant had to be renewed. And so you just see that progression of through the years where it gets renewed and then they forget and it gets renewed again. And I bet you can imagine which ones that was. Hezekiah, Josiah, and I always say Jehoiada because it was Jehoiada's doings that led to it. He wasn't the king, he was the high priest, but he's the one of those there. So we see that renewing that goes on. So covenant being renewed, that is a big deal. I think I tried to call that to your attention last time. But after those things, then we have the judges. We know going through all the judges, we finally get to the end of that cycle of judges, that repeated cycle from Othniel, the first judge, all the way down to Samuel. But what happened at the end of Samuel's life? They wanted a king. Why did they want a king? Wanted to be like other nations? That's one reason. There is another reason given. Because Samuel's sons were a bunch of lazy bums and unrighteous people, and they did a lot of evil. I mean, the text is pretty clear about the taking of bribes and injustice that they were perpetrating, and so they asked for a king. Samuel took great offense to that, but God told him, tell him what a king's going to do, and that led us to the United Kingdom. We have Saul, David, and Solomon, and that gets the United Kingdom. And then what breaks the kingdom apart? What separates the United Kingdom and begins the divided kingdom? Rehoboam and Jeroboam. That's Jeroboam, Rehoboam, Solomon's son. I'll get that right. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, took bad advice. I always have taken that. He was kind of arrogant. He didn't listen. Hard-headed. Anybody else besides me been that way before? Don't listen to someone who's wiser's advice. I've been guilty of that. Well, he took bad advice.
And you can't miss the fact either that this is a young man listening to his peers. And I think most of us who are older can say whenever we were younger, that's who we probably would have preferred to listen to rather than the advice of those we saw as older and more outdated. And so that's just a warning for young people. You have to be careful not to resist that impulse and that the pride is what it is to say, old people don't know anything, and so I'm just going to, I'm going to listen to me and my friends. We understand the situation. That was his mistake, and it cost him the kingdom.
That's right.
A large part of it.
And it was only because of the promises that had been made that Rehoboam is allowed to keep the 2 tribes. So 10 of the tribes rebel, and he keeps the two southern tribes, and so that causes the kingdom to divide. Now, moving through the divided kingdom, we know that it lasted about 200 years. And with that being the case, how did the divided kingdom come to an end? Israel went into captivity. They were taken by Assyria, led by Sargon II, because of their unrighteousness. This was judgment on Israel. Because through that 200 years, how many faithful kings did they have? 0. It was wholly unrighteous. And so we see them being punished, being led away by Assyria, and that leads us to Judah being alone. Judah lasted another 135 years, and we know that they lasted there because of the righteousness of several of their kings, as we've talked about previously. It allowed them to continue, but ultimately, and as we were looking at last week towards the end of class, some of those last 4 or 5 kings led them astray just as badly as Israel had. But and finally Judah was taken away by Babylon, led by Nebuchadnezzar, and took Judah into captivity. And so that gets us to where we are tonight, is Judah in captivity. Crawford. Right. That's exactly right. Some of the things that I was reading and researching over the last few days wasn't biblical history, it was world history. Because the Battle of Carchemish is pretty well documented of the things that went on between Egypt and Babylon. And yet that ties into Josiah directly. And his death, that Pharaoh Necho, on the way up to the Battle of Carchemish, he tries to intercede and stir trouble, and that's what caused him to get killed there at the end of his life. And so there's some intertwining and some verification we can see through even secular facts and secular history, more than what we just have preserved in the Bible. Which, by the way, to me, I don't know about for you, that helps, that bolsters my faith. To be able to see that there's evidence beyond what we have right here. Not that this isn't enough, but it's verifiable even from other sources, from antagonistic sources. And so that is an encouragement to me. And so finally, Judah in captivity ends, and we'll get to this hopefully towards the end, when Zerubbabel led the first wave of the remnant back to rebuild the temple. And so that's where we're going to stop with our linking stories. We'll fast forward through a little bit of these. We remember the major events before the flood. That's there. We have creation in chapter 1. Adam and Eve in the garden. First sin. Cain and Abel. Generations. It's been a while since we talked about those. But those are those 5. Creation, Adam and Eve in the garden, first sin, Cain and Abel, and generations. I think we've got these first few the best. It gets a little harder. The flood, what do we have? The flood itself, chapter 6, 7, 8. Then we have meat given for food. Yeah, I hear you. Law of capital punishment. Yep. Covenant of the rainbow. Yep. Curse on Canaan. Y'all are doing great. And then generations to wind it back up. Really good job. I'm impressed. All right. Next one is the scattering of the people. This is so short, but it's so obvious too. We have building of the tower. The languages are divided. And then the generations to the patriarchs. So that one's almost to just say what it was, what happened in that one. That's not much shorter than the verses themselves. All right, so the patriarchs, that's an easy one to remember. If you can remember the 4 names, who are they? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so we see that transition story of Joseph. All right, now we're getting to the tough stuff. There's a lot more material. I can tell in my own study, and I think I can tell in Brother Waldron's study, like, okay, he's very succinct at times. The patriarchs. Boom, 4 names, got it. But you get over here to the Exodus, he doesn't give you just 4 names, but there's so much material. It's a lot. So just to help go through this. So during the Exodus, through that period, we have Israel in bondage. We have Moses' birth. We have Moses raised as Pharaoh's daughter. I'm sorry, raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. It's 2025, but he didn't do that. We know that then he was rejected by his people and had to flee to the wilderness. So after he fled to the wilderness, while in the wilderness, he came into, God called him through the burning bush. And that after being called, he comes back. Then we have the plagues. After the plagues, the completion of the plagues, we have the crossing of the Red Sea. And this to me where it gets easy. The trip down to Sinai, the events at Sinai, the trip to Kadesh Barnea, and then the events at Kadesh Barnea, so which are the spies sent into the land. And ultimately we know the result of that, where they refuse to go in. So if you can get to the crossing of the Red Sea, to me it's just very logically progressive. That's right. Okay. I haven't noticed that, but that'll help me remember it. So we see those progression and see the story. And that's what we're trying to do in this cycle, is to remind us of the story. All right, so the wandering, we know that Israel was sentenced to wander in the wilderness. And then one of the first events is that rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then we have Aaron's rod that budded, which that was the result of the rebellion. That was the sign God sent that said, nope, listen to them. These are my people. They all brought forth the staff, and it was Aaron's that budded because it was proof that God was with them. And they were speaking on God's behalf and had authority from him. Then we get to Miriam's death, the sin of Moses and Aaron, passing by Edom, Aaron's death, fiery serpents, the conquering of Sihon and Og, then the fun stories of Balaam. Those are always fun to think about. When you get to talking donkeys, you got my attention. And then the fornication with the Midianites, which is a sad story. And then the second census, which tells me we're getting close to the end, right? Because the slaughter of the Midianites, the speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy, because that is right before they go in. Moses dies, and then the crossing of the Jordan, which we know, as we mentioned earlier, that's that part of that linking story. So we get those last couple all real close together. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. I don't know if y'all remember when we did it with the board up here. I left the numbers, but I was pulling out that's the same type of principle. Helps you jog your memory that way. Invasion and conquest was pretty easy, right? We had the central campaign, the southern campaign, and then the northern campaign. Then we get the land distribution, and the tribes go home. And then finally, Joshua's speeches right there at the end, and the renewal of the covenant. If you'll notice, we get a little more specific, seemingly, at the end of the periods, because that's the things that kick us to the next one. So, I mean, the central, southern, and northern campaign, there's a lot more text there, but we get more specific because of the unique nature of the ends of each period. All right, so we know the judges, right? Or hopefully be able to sing the song, and then just add the story of Micah, the Levite's concubine, and the book of Ruth at the end. United Kingdom, y'all got this one. We just talked about it, and it's just 3 names. Saul, David, and Solomon. 40 years apiece for the 120 years. And then the divided kingdom. This is one of those where it's a little bit not as direct. Almost wish he would have given us just a list of the kings. But we have Israel in the north, Judah in the south. We know that, he tells us that it lasts for 200 years. Then we go through the prophets in this period of Obadiah, Joel, Amos, Hosea. And then we call Isaiah and Micah the linking two. Why do we call them the linking two prophets there?
They're prophesying when Israel was taken into captivity.
That's right. They're there at the divided kingdom, and they continued prophesying through Judah into Judah alone, and so they kind of bridge that gap of history. And so if we want to learn about what's going on during that transition time, you can go to Isaiah, you can go to Micah, and see what's going on as we transition during that time period. And again, with us learning the story, we're kind of breaking it apart and segmenting it as we go through this. But it's really just one story. And that's where knowing these links like this kind of helps link it together. And that's our effort in that. All right, and then we got to Judah alone. And this is where we were last week. And so we had talked about Ahaz as a wicked king, and then his son Hezekiah, who was a righteous king. And I put in yellow the ones that are mentioned by Brother Waldron in the book for memorization. It was Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. But that's not all the kings, because we have people like Ammon who are inserted, and then Josiah. But the 3 for memorization purposes, Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah. And I did not finish my material on Judah alone, but that's okay. I just wanted to clarify a couple things. I was talking to Mr. Dennis at the end, and I want to just make sure that I'm clear on this. It can be very confusing because of the names. And I mentioned this, but I was having to do it so hurriedly, I think I didn't help the confusion. So Shallum is one of the kings. His name is changed by Pharaoh Necho to Jehoahaz. So Shallum is Jehoahaz. It was an assertion of Pharaoh Necho's power that to change Shallum's name and just show that you're under my thumb. I'm in control. So he was king. So if you ever hear Shallum, it's the same as Jehoahaz. Well, yes, that's another random fact you have to have memorized to know the story. So if we're talking about Jehoahaz, well, who is that? Connecting the dots. And it doesn't get any easier because they were the son of who? Who was Shallum the son of? We remember? Go back one slide.
Josiah, wasn't it?
Josiah. So Josiah's son, Shallum, name was changed, and he was allowed to reign for 3 months. That's the right language. He was allowed to reign for 3 months, actually 3 months and 10 days. Chronicles tells us specifically. And then we have Eliakim and Jehoiakim. Same person, similar situation. Who is Eliakim to Shallum? May I remember? They're brothers. So one brother was allowed to reign for 3 months and 10 days. And Pharaoh Necho, after he changed his name, apparently didn't like him, had some type of problem with him, removed him from kingship. Then he was put on the throne by Pharaoh Necho. And we know that he was forced to pay tribute. And he did. And so that's why he was allowed to reign for 11 years. That's why he was allowed to stay in place, because it was at Necho's...
He's probably a little more submissive.
Yeah, that's right. A little more willing to pay, less rebellious, less stubborn, more compliant. And so we see that. And it's also here during this time, Eliakim's time, Jehoiakim's time, that we have the first invasion. And so when we talk about overlapping periods, everybody went with the first invasion. And so we're going to talk about Daniel here in just a moment, because he goes with that first invasion. He's taken away during the time of Jehoiakim, which is, we'll see some dates on that in just a moment. But we talked about perspective. When we see Daniel, who's taken away in the first wave, in his early writing, we would call that during the captivity. But when we look at Ezekiel in his early writing, we would call that Judah alone. Why? Even though chronologically it may happen almost at the same time. Location. Ezekiel was taken in the second wave. And Zach's going to talk about that, so I don't want to go into any detail more than that. But because of that, that's how we get overlap in our writing. And so it's very important for us to be able to tell. Ultimately, we have the fall of Assyria and Nebuchadnezzar, which leads and we get into the next kingdom. What came after Assyria? Babylon. So we have Babylon rising up. And so now we're to another king, Jehoiachin, which he also goes by Coniah or Jeconiah. So 3 names, 1 person.
It's not confusing.
That's not confusing at all. Jeconiah and Coniah are always easy for me to recognize, but that OIH, there's a C in there. Try to connect those if you can. The thing that I like to bring up about this, he was the one that was prophesied that he would not be, his seed would not be on the throne any longer. And we see him being mentioned and the carrying away to Babylon mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. What is Matthew chapter 1? The genealogy of Christ. So why is that significant in regards to false teaching today? That's right. Jesus is not going to be an earthly king. He's a direct descendant. He's in Matthew chapter 1 as in that lineage. And so when you hear about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, when he returns, that he's going to sit on his throne in Jerusalem, they've missed it. He's not going to sit on an earthly physical throne. And so we see that he is reigning now, but he will not sit on that throne. And we can look at this as a refutation of that doctrine. And I remember when I learned that in college, going through this material, I'm like, whoa, okay, that was concrete to me. And I remember Matt Leverett was teaching. I remember specifically him explaining that, and just that was a big epiphany for me. So maybe that'll help you as well. And then we finally get to the last one, Mattaniah, and his name was changed, not by Pharaoh Necho like the other two. His name was changed by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar played the same card that Necho did, so Mattaniah was changed to Zedekiah. Again, for us trying to remember all these names, it's confusing. You may get all the kings of Israel and Judah learned, and then you got to get the deviations of it too, because it causes us. But he was the third son of Josiah and an uncle to Jehoiachin. So Jehoiachin, who was just taken away, his uncle, and that's how it wasn't a contradiction. It was still of the seed of David, but it was not his lineage. And so where he was cursed there in Jeremiah, well, it was his uncle that followed after him. And so God involved. That's not coincidence. All right. Now, finally, 30 minutes in, and we're just now to the captivity. There was a question Sunday night about the 70 years of captivity. And I think Ethan's the one that asked it. And so I did some reading about this, and I couldn't give him a straight answer. When do we define the 70 years? Well, I've got 4 answers. And so I'll share those with you. I'm not sure which one I believe is the most plausible yet. They all make sense, but here's what some of the things I found. So first, Eugene Merrill in his book, Kingdom of Priests, dates Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy from 605 to 539. Well, you don't have to be much of a mathematician to realize that's not exactly 70 years. 66 years. And so that's what Eugene Merrill presents in his book. And he makes the statement that this is obviously a round number since the captivity was only 66 years in fact, but the figure is close enough for Daniel to use it in Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. And then the reference to 70 years from Zechariah 1 and verse 12 and 7 and verse 5 applies to a different period, that between the destruction of the temple, 586, and its rebuilding in 515. So that's
not without precedent. The 30. Remember, you mentioned the 40 years of wandering is actually 38.
right.
So it's not without precedent for that to be reasonable.
Right. The other side of that is, in the wandering in the wilderness, they had been gone from Exodus, from Egypt for 40 years, and so you can come up with an exact 40. And so the article that I had read was actually from I think it was from Bob Jones' seminary website, and so take it for what you want. But that's why I'm giving the full disclosure. But the author of that article mentioned 3 other possibilities. He said that the 70 years of Babylonian domination over Judah and the surrounding nations. The author of the article did not like the lack of specificity or the lack of exactness, and so he noted these 3: 70 years of Babylonian domination over Judah, and then cites Jeremiah 25. 70 years of Jewish captivity in Babylon, 605 to 536, and then 70 years of indignation on Jerusalem and Judah, marked by the destruction and rebuilding of the temple. So I'm not exactly sure which one of those is the specific prophecy, but there's clearly a 70-year, or really close to 70-year period that this captivity takes place. So that was my novelty reading for the last few days. Hopefully that helped somebody. All right, so as we're going through this time period, and as I mentioned earlier, the history is just immense through this. And so we can start tying dates to it, and it really helps me keep things in order. So in 640, we have Josiah's reign begins. In 626, Jeremiah begins his work. So we're laying a little bit of foundation there. At 625, Babylon gains independence from Assyria. So that's where we see a little bit of political change. 621, Josiah begins his reforms. We remember that he found it at 16, and the temple reforms at 18, and then the full-blown throughout the nation happened at 20. So that's 621 there. Nineveh falls in 612. So we know that that's after the book of Jonah, right? Because that's who he prophesied to. So, and then Josiah dies in the conflict with Pharaoh Necho. We remember that he was interceding or bothering Necho as he was going up for the Battle of Carchemish, which was a few years later, actually, where that took full place. But Shallum and Jehoahaz was made king. 609 was a big year. When I say big year, hectic year. There was a lot of turbulence and strife going on. So Josiah, a good king, dies. The last good king dies. Shallum was put in place. Eliakim was put in place and then taken away. Jehoiakim becomes a subject to Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lot of political turmoil, a lot of anxiety going on in the nation of Judah at this time. So we have in 605 the Battle of Carchemish between Egypt, which is Pharaoh Necho, and Nebuchadnezzar, which is Babylon. Anybody know who wins? Babylon. Babylon wins. And so there's a good history about them fleeing and the things that happen as they flee from there. And so Daniel in 605 is taken to Babylon. And so going through the book of Daniel just very quickly, and again, we're just doing a high cut of this. So we have him going back with the first group of captives. When he gets there, we know that he doesn't want to defile himself and partake of the king's food. And then getting into chapter 2, we get the Nebuchadnezzar's statue dream. And this was a difficult thing because not only did they want the interpretation of the dream, what else did he demand? Tell me even what the dream was. It wasn't like what Pharaoh, there's what I saw, tell me what it means. Tell me what I saw, tell me what I saw meant. And so he was on the verge of killing all his wise men, and then Daniel's like, hold on. I don't have this, but God does. And so we see him giving that. We will come back to this dream more.
Very significant.
It's very significant. And particularly we'll use this, the way that I approach the time between the testaments, the years of silence, is using that dream as our outline. Because we get the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and start using that just to outline what we're going to talk about during that time period. You also get a changing to his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, with their faithfulness. I believe it's verse 17, one of my favorite verses. Even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down. That's one of my favorite verses there in that altercation, interaction of the fiery furnace. During this time, Jehoiakim rebels. See, we're in captivity talking right now, but there's still Jews in Judah. They haven't all been, the destruction of the temple doesn't happen until 586. And so we're kind of split with two fronts. This is a two-front story. And so 598 to 97 Babylonian army sets out for Egypt and Judah. Ezekiel is taken in the second group, and Zedekiah is made king in Judah, which if we remember, he was the last one, that puppet king, and stays there from 597. He reigned for how many years? It was on that previous slide, 11 years. 597 minus 11, 586. He was the king when Jerusalem was sacked. So, that gets us to Ezekiel. He told me he only needed 7 minutes to do all of Ezekiel.
That's exactly what you gave me, but I'm really glad. Daniel and Ezekiel are probably two of the most challenging books in the entire Old Testament, so I'm glad I've only got 7 minutes. I may not need that much. So there's 3 major prophets during the exile, and Luke's mentioned how these are kind of concurrent. You have, if I got one more coming up? Yep. Hope so. Maybe having trouble with my clicker.
Oops, sorry.
3 major prophets during this period of time where you've got Judah in captivity. We're going forward, not backward. But Jeremiah. You have Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. They are going to be at 3 different places because God's people were dispersed to 3 different places at that time. Jeremiah is the first one, and he He's in Jerusalem. That's where he remains, and he's later exiled to Egypt. Daniel's taken away, as Luke mentioned, with the first group of captives, and so his ministry is going to be among the Babylonian nobility. So he works a lot with the kings, and he sees many of the kings, all of the kings of the Babylonian Empire rise and fall, and even into that the next world power that comes into front and center stage, which is the Persians. So he's there for multiple dynasties and multiple nations. So he's working among the elite. Meanwhile, Ezekiel, he's kind of the last one onto the same time-wise. He prophesies among the exiled Judeans. So the ones that were deported to Babylon, that's where Ezekiel's working among them. So you've got those three prophets kind of working concurrently. First Jeremiah, then later Daniel comes onto the scene, and Ezekiel comes on a little bit later to work with a different group of people. Daniel's ministry is actually going to extend the longest, though. So let me just quickly highlight some of the things we'll need to know about Ezekiel. We'll just keep going through this. Just to kind of give you a big picture of the book, there was the mention of the deportation. So just significant dates to be aware of is Ezekiel being called as a prophet. 593, the first three verses highlight his being called by God to carry the word of the Lord to his people. He's warned of Jerusalem's doom, and that's what he spends the first years of his ministry doing, telling the people Jerusalem's going to fall. And in fact, the Lord says you're going to be mute for a period of time, and then the next when you hear word that Jerusalem has fallen, then you'll be able to speak again. And that occurs in 586 when word is brought to Ezekiel that Jerusalem's been destroyed, the temple's been ravaged, the walls have been torn down, and the people have been killed, and he's able to open his mouth and speak again, and again to continue in his ministry. And his ministry ends around 571. He's real good throughout the course of his book of saying, this is when I received a vision from the Lord, and then he goes on to make known that. But he's got several points throughout the course of his writings where he sets a specific period of time and says, this is when the Lord appeared to me, and then he'll communicate that. Ezekiel 1:1, he was called as a prophet at 30 years old. It's mentioned that he is, I'm not clicking, that thing's just going. It's mentioned at 30 years old he's called as a prophet. That's significant because you may remember he was a priest, and that's when priests would begin their ministry. So there's some significance to him being called to be a voice for God at 30 years old, because if he were in Jerusalem at the temple, that's when he would have been called in service to the Lord. And so that's whenever he's called to be a prophet, and God gives him the first series of visions and messages that he's to communicate to the people. He begins in the first 11 chapters by just making accusations against Israel. And one of the most significant events being in chapter 10, where he sees the glory of God, the Shekinah glory of God. That's where God's name was placed. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. God's glory departs because of all of the idolatry that's taking place in Jerusalem. And so God's glory has left his people. And unsurprisingly, the consequence of that, if God's no longer with them, they're going to be left on their own, and they're going to be destroyed. But despite all of the negativity and forewarning, chapter 11 does give the people a ray of hope that God is going to preserve a remnant. He's going to place a new heart and spirit within them so that they're going to keep the Word of God, and God's going to bring them back and continue his relationship with them. So despite all of the doom and gloom, there is good news ahead. In chapters 12 through 24, he talks about judgment on Israel, where he highlights Judah's wickedness, and he justifies God's vindication, God's judgment on those people. So just he's speaking there and to the people of God in Judah. In chapters, you didn't see that, you may not have saw that. In chapters 25 through 32, judgment on the nations. And then in chapter 33, the destruction of Jerusalem is made known. In the 12th year of our exile, in the 10th month, on the 5th day of the month, a fugitive from Jerusalem came and said, the city has been struck down. Okay, and so he'd been mute up to that point, but now his mouth is opened, and he's again able to speak to the people again. And so that happens 2/3 of the way through the book. And then the last section, chapters 34 through 47, he speaks of hope for God's people. The significance of that being God's people were in captivity, and they've got to be wondering, is this it for us? And despite the judgment that he foretold was going to occur, the message is no, it's not. There is a reason for hope. God's not going to abandon his people completely. They're going to be given a new leader. This is, I think, a reference to perhaps some immediate rulers that come in, but primarily it's pointing to Jesus, where this new David is going to come and replace the corrupt shepherds which were unjust and abusive to the people. The people were going to be given a new heart and spirit. And in chapter 37, you have there the vision of the dry bones. And that's just really a depiction of Judah spiritually. They are these dry bones. But then God is going to breathe on them, and flesh is going to knit together, and the bones are going to live. And it's talking about the spiritual restoration that's going to occur when God restores his people. And then the book of Ezekiel ends in chapters 40 through 48 with restoration. In chapter 40, he sees a new temple. In chapter 43, remember, God's glory departed, but he sees God's glory returning to the temple. Chapter 47, he sees a river of life flowing from the temple. By the way, there's a lot of connections. Randy could tell us more on this if he were here, between Ezekiel and Revelation. A lot of the symbolism in Revelation you can find here in the book of Ezekiel, and that's helpful in understanding that. So you see a river flowing from the temple, and then you see Jerusalem being given this new name, the name being the Lord is there. And so what that seems to represent to me, and this is some of the more challenging parts, is grasping the specific things that may have applied to, is that God sees reconciliation, restoration, and healing for his people. I think that's what's happening in chapters 40 through 48.
Some of you may be asking why we didn't talk about Daniel in the lion's den, because Daniel is an old man when that happens. And so there's a portion of that narrative where it's early in his life, and then it seems to go silent for a while, chapter 1 through 3, and then the later stuff happens there 4 through 6 or so in that narrative portion. And so as a kid, I always thought Daniel was young when he was in the lion's den. He was an old man. He would have been able to see some of the remnant return, but from what we understand, he never went back to Judah himself. And so we see that there. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail as we move forward into the third cycle. But there's lots of names and leaders that we'll need to know. We've talked about Necho, Nebuchadnezzar, but we'll also get more into Darius, Belshazzar, and Cyrus, which are all pertinent to this time period.
Y'all don't be overwhelmed. I know this is a lot of material, but we're really going to be able to camp out on these things when we come back. The point of, as we've said, of cycle 2 is really just to kind of give us this big picture overview. And we'll add to our memory what we can, but really when we dig into the third cycle, we're going to be able to put these things more deeply in mind and be able to commit more time to memory. So don't be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of material. I know it's a lot. So I think everybody's doing a great job in how far we've come so far.
Thank you.